the loudest little 12-year-old on the block. The first dozen years of Q104, Part 1, Life Before Q. The first day of the last week of November 1983, a federal court of appeal gave the green light to U.S. cruise missile tests over Canadian soil. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau was in China to talk disarmament. Hogtown felt the dizzying after effects of their first Grey Cup celebration in 31 years. A new pop sensation named Madonna was rocketing up the dance club charts with her first hit. In Halifax, Nova Scotia, the Chum Radio Group's AM and FM combo was dominating the city's airwaves. And it was announced that day that C100 FM had edged out its sister station, CJCH, to take top spot in the ratings for the very first time. But from the other side of the harbor, early in the morning of that last Monday in November, Nova Scotians were introduced to a brand new radio station whose goal it was to shake that place like never before.
603, this is Brother Jake Edwards, Hal Harbor, the Q Zoo, and our first morning metal song for a Monday. Time to get up and rock your socks to Black Sabbath.
In 83, when we launched, we had a lot of characters and surprisingly enough came out of the box flying. Our first ratings book was right through the roof. It was really quite a success story. It still is today.
Q104, the home of rock and roll!
Everywhere we went, the response was just great. Any concerts that we presented, any contests we did, any trips that we organized, any baseball games, charity events were always incredibly well attended. Any rallies that we instigated, bring Rush to Halifax. The overall thing would be, Q rules! You'd see it spray painted on walls and stuff.
So amazing. Oh, sorry, Andrew. You remember me, Andrew? Yeah, hi, Andrew. Remember? We were cloned by the guys at the Dow Lab.
Yeah. We hit the Nova Scotia border and tuned in Q104 for the first time, and I was a fan for life. I had never heard a radio station as creative as Q104 anywhere, ever.
We do the Lake Bannock call. Lake Bannock!
Q104. Kiss ass. It would hardly tell the story of Q104's proud history to begin in 1983, so let's set the scene in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, some 55 years earlier, with the birth of Charles Arnold Patterson.
1928, the 2nd of July. So I am now a genuine senior, but I was born in Dartmouth. Was a very small town then, about 5,000 people. And I've also had the distinction of my father and my grandfather were both born in Dartmouth, so my roots go back a long way. They go back to a Scottish soldier named Jock, who came here with the Black Watch, I think in about the 1820s, and who settled in Dartmouth.
From an early age, Arnie was intrigued by radio, but as he matured, he aspired to become a newsman in the print medium.
But I always wanted to be a journalist. I think from the time I was grade 5. In grade 5, I used to do Foster Hewitt imitations, who was the great hockey broadcaster, and was editor of the class newspaper in grade 5 or 6, and then later took journalism at St. Mary's. And while I worked in radio, my major occupation and prime interest was really writing and newspapers, and I worked in the Halifax papers as a young guy. Graduation, also worked at CJCH at that time with Danny Galvin doing hockey, and then Pat Connolly, who was my long-time cohort. We worked together, and then I went to Toronto and worked in the papers. Later went into public relations as a speechwriter with General Motors, but my early career was largely newspapers with radio as a secondary interest. And in fact, my emergence as an owner of a radio station really was secondary to owning papers, but I wanted to come back home. I was living in Montreal and had made an attempt to buy the then Dartmouth Free Press, which I had been involved in its founding with Kelly Morton. Then I started CFDR as a radio station, and then was largely radio, although I don't know. They're a good crossover medium because they're much the same.
Where quality is foremost, where news is first. You're tuned to radio at its best on CFDR 790.
Now the news to 12 noon, Vince Gallant reporting. The Roman Catholic world has a new pope, Paul VI.
And now, Big D Sports with Clary Fleming and Danny Gallivan.
Rounding up the local sports scene firstly, and we look at tonight's harness racing card at Saxville Downs. The feature event of the evening will be a junior free-for-all pace with 6 fast starters set to go. Post time 8 o'clock for harness racing tonight at Saxville Downs. All is in readiness for the big professional boxing show at the Halifax Forum, slated for Tuesday, June 25th. The principals, Canadian middleweight champion Blair Richardson and Bob Young from Providence, Rhode Island, are expected in the city over the weekend. Danny Gallivan now joins us on CFDR Sports, and it's baseball today as he talks with Canadian-born first baseman of the New York Mets, Tim Harkness.
Tim, you've gone from a pennant contender, Los Angeles Dodgers, to a last-place club, the New York Mets. However, I should imagine you're quite satisfied with the setup because in New York you have an opportunity to play regularly.
That's right, Danny. That's the most important thing about being in the major leagues is getting a chance to play.
Arie Patterson had struck up a friendship and built an on-air repartee with Danny Gallivan while at CJCH in the 50s, calling the games of the Halifax Atlantics under coach Duggar McNeil during the glory days of the Sydney Millionaires, the Glace Bay Miners, Charlottetown Islanders, and other legendary maritime teams.
We were the hockey broadcasters. I did the color, and now I was working at that time. I was the City Hall reporter for the Halifax Herald, but I also worked at CJ and radio and did it for 4 or 5 years, and was also doing, Jerry Regan and I were doing harness race broadcasts for CKCL in Truro, and I did that for 4 or 5 years, which was great fun. And the great Art Manning, who is now retired, but he owned the station in those days. And at CJ, it was a great operation. We were all very young, of course, because it's a long time ago, more than 40 years, and Finley MacDonald was the boy president and our leader. Halifax was a much smaller city and very intimate, but I think no less fun than it is today, and perhaps even more fun because you knew everyone. But the hockey was the days of the Big Four and the days of the Halifax and District Baseball League, which was the best baseball we've ever had. And the hockey, while not American League caliber, wasn't far below it. And it was a great memories.
Hi, this is Jerry Parsons, and I begin the day at CFDR each morning at 6 with the Rise and Shine show. Remember how good radio used to sound? Well, we here at CFDR try to make it sound interesting again with a pleasing personality and an awareness that in the early morning people don't want shouting singers, screaming trumpets, and talkative announcers. My job is to get them out of the right side of the bed, through the washing and dressing chores, on the outside of a hearty breakfast, and off to work or school. To do this, we play bright quality music, 2 instrumentals to every vocal, and intersperse this with news every half hour, the time before and after each record, the weather forecast twice every 30 minutes, and sports scores every half hour. We remind them about milk deliveries, garbage collections, and upcoming events in moderation. There's a joke or two every hour, researched from one of the largest stockpiles of humor in eastern Canada, and little features like the morning hymn, 5 minutes with Walter Brennan, and the off-to-school march.
CFDR may not have ever been realized had things gone by Arie Patterson's plan. As he recalled in Q104's Dartmouth studio in the fall of 1994, Arnie's goal was to buy a local newspaper instead.
When I was a young reporter in the Chronicle Herald and only out of journalism school a few years, Ralph Kelly Morton, who was a great newspaper man and came home from New York, the Associated Press, and started the Dartmouth Free Press, which was a successor paper to the Dartmouth Patriot, which had gone bankrupt in about 1950. And I had grown up on the Patriot. I was the sports editor, and I was almost like a one-man rewrite team. I used to go in and put the paper out when I was still in school. Could run the linotype and do a few other things, and used to go up and watch and help Melly Hilton and his sons set type in a building which is not far removed from where we are now here at Queen Square. It was right here in Alderney Drive, which was then called Commercial Street. I was interested in the Free Press. Kelly was interested in selling it, but he didn't for a number of years. So I had applied for a radio license. And my contention was Dartmouth didn't have a daily voice, and that its own identity was important. And this was the course we pursued, and which I've always pursued. And while we were a metro station, and our audience was in fact bigger in Halifax than it was in Dartmouth in most instances, I always gave emphasis to Dartmouth, Halifax coverage. We covered both, but probably did far more in Dartmouth than anyone else. And we covered such things, not only the elections in detail, the municipal elections, but things like the canoe races or other things of that nature. And certainly our charitable activities were on the side of the harbor.
From its sign-on in 1962, CFDR established itself as a formidable adult radio commodity with an enormous loyal following. And though he put his faith in strong management and talented staff, Arie Patterson employed a hands-on approach to the station, taking pride in its Dartmouth roots. In fact, the call letters reflect its location, DR, representing Dartmouth Radio. And Arie became known affectionately to many as Mr. Dartmouth.
The sound of news, the sound of weather and sports, the sound of true good music, ships at sea and traffic reports, the sound of good music. In your home or in your car, CFDR is Metro.
Arie Patterson was a high-profile Liberal supporter, and in 1979, the seductive scent of politics lured him to Ottawa for a year, in the position of press secretary under Prime Minister Trudeau. Meanwhile, CFDR had become the only standalone AM station in the Halifax-Dartmouth radio market. So 1979 also became the year Arie Patterson applied to the Canadian Radio Television Telecommunications Commission, the CRTC, for an FM radio license.
Q was an invention of necessity to meet the market demand, although I must say that it was thrilling and exciting and a different kind of radio for me. One I really never totally, I shouldn't say understood because I appreciate it, but one that I really didn't feel that I could participate in because I didn't know much about the music. But it was just great fun. And Q, having been such a great success, and it never surprised me because it was always there, CFDR was very successful and very solid. But the audience was getting older, and as well, we were in a competition, and I was the single owner-operator in competition with two giants, Chum, who had CJCH and C100, and McLean Hunter, who owned CHFX and CHNS. So to meet the competition, we were really like a guy in a fight with one good arm. And we had given thought to FM radio. FM... Strangely, while FM has the big part of the market now, in those days FM had a very small share, and it was always the weak cousin. But around 1980 we started, in fact we had applied for a license in 1980, made a botch of it, and I was one of the participants. We went to the hearing, didn't know much about rock music, didn't know much about FM, and we were rejected, which we should have been. And we reapplied a year or two later. I guess it was 79 that we had applied. But we went back 2 years later and were successful.
Future Q104 program director and morning man, Bob Powers.
See, the original POP was put together by Jack Hutchison and Paul Marr. And when it didn't fly, they recruited Pat Donlan, who was coming back to the Maritimes. He was up in Moncton, who's now with Newcap Broadcasting at C103 in Moncton, which is really neat. I used to be his paper boy. He'd hate me for saying that. He's a much older man than I am.
The embryonic Q104 was now more than just an idea, and FM rock radio was finally Halifax bound. But a rock and roll format was not the initial intention of Patterson and Company.
You know, the idea of a rock station was not the dominant thought in my head in the early days. We'd looked at country music at one point. And I was in Toronto and was attracted to Q107, And Alan Slate, who owned the station then and was a friend of mine who I'd known in the radio business, and I went to see him, and he suggested I talk to his son, which I did. And one of the benefits that came out of that meeting was the recommendation that I hire Brother Jake as the morning man, who was then in Winnipeg. And I think we were just parking him for a later return to Q107, but he gave us a launch and gave us 2 solid years of broadcasting. Was a dynamic factor in the Nova Scotia radio market. And as well, we really basically, not knowing much about rock, which I certainly didn't, followed the Q107 format with a few other innovations. Basically, we did the Japanese thing and copied what we thought was a good thing, rather than try and invent something ourselves about something which, despite all the years I'd been in radio, that I thought we knew little about.
Brother Jake Edwards was a brash, cocky, young radio personality brimming with talent. He was a veteran of maritime radio, having entertained listeners in Bathurst, New Glasgow, Sydney, and Moncton. Jake impressed Arie Patterson as a bilingual person, fluent in both English and profanity.
K. Breton's news leader. You may not know this, but while you were listening to the news, Tom Peck was quietly passing a kidney stone.
Baby, you are my driving wheel. I'm going to shift gears all over you. Can at Music Radio CJCB. Bay City Rollers. At number 1. They made it down to number 5 in the Super 40. Hanging on at number 38. The Bay City Rollers have got the Yesterday Hero for you.
Music Radio CJCB.
10:23 at Music Radio CJCB. Natalie Cole has got love on her mind as it draws her to the number 92 position on the 100. You've got the brother on your radio.
That's the way I like it.
Too bad, Bucky, that's not the way I like it. Yeah.
800-565-7421.
Give it to me. Oh, give it to me. Oh, give it to me. Shake it in the bleacher. Shake it on down. I'm your teacher. I'm your teacher. Shake it on down. Hit lines are open, children. Shake it in the aisle. Shake it on down. Hit lines are open. Burning up time. Get your pupil. Down, down, down. On down. I am the god of hellfire, and I bring you Jake Edwards.
One longtime fan of Brother Jake Edwards was Raymond Plourde, later known to Q104 listeners as Rockin' Ray.
I'm from Bathurst, New Brunswick, and I got into radio in high school and never looked back. I actually was one of the few people probably to remember Brother Jake Edwards in his salad days as Super Soul Basil Roll, loving you like a teddy bear here on CKBC at Bathurst, New Brunswick. He had, I think it was like his first radio gig outside of his time down in Boston. I think he went to college in Boston, and it was inspirational. Even back then, he was very different than he is now as Brother Jake Edwards. He as he left Bathurst, I remember he told me that he and a music director, or a fellow jock anyway, a friend of his up there, kind of went out for a car drive and said, you know, I need a new identity, something different, something really shake people up. I'm going to a new station. I think he was going to Moncton or Sydney or somewhere else in the Maritimes, and they came up with Brother Jake Edwards, and from that point forward, that's what he was. But I remember him before then, and as a young junior high school student and then high school, I remember listening to him thinking, that's really cool, I'd like to get into that, so I kind of followed along here.
Look how we got dance with me and Peter Brown getting down with the sound of more night at the Gun Chancy Rail. I would just like to see everybody get out there. Gonna break the boogeyman call one more time for Linda and Judah. 1, 2, 3, that's it. Boogeyman! He's everywhere! He's everywhere! In order to... Hey, the way he says that, listen, one more time here. They say John Travolta on this record. You ready for this? One more time. John Travolta, hear that? Isn't that crazy? Guy doesn't have enough PR already, huh? Oh, well, what's a few more $1 million?
Born and raised in Moncton, New Brunswick. Wanted to come back back in 1982, thought about coming back, thought about opening up FM rock radio, because there wasn't anything happening. I mean, there just wasn't anything happening. I mean, every AC, adult contemporary, CHR radio station, it can't change Western, and it really needed a kick in the pants. And being a Maritimer and having the opportunity to come back was a big thrill. And I decided that I would quit my job at City FM in Winnipeg, 360,000 watts, the most powerful FM radio station in the world. They have 3 of them there. And I'm going along, and I've got the town right by the Gennards. And I'm thinking, well, you know, maybe I'd like to go back to the Maritime. So we up and quit, a fellow by the name of Gary Obie and I. And we decided to come out here, and we wrote up an application, and I was going to become partner with Gary Obie, and the station was going to become Magic 103. So we had our presentation. We had up against the CRTC board back then, who were pretty old. Some old people over there that really didn't understand what rock and roll was all about, I think, back then. And our presentation, I mean, was mind-blowing. We had 3 Crown amplifiers set up with AR9 speakers. We set the whole presentation up. This is Magic 103. You know, and there was just like rock and roll music coming out. Magic 103 is power. It's fun. And they do some stuff that I was doing out in Winnipeg. And then Arie Patterson got up. And Arnie, bless his soul, I love Arnie. Arnie decided that he was going to be a public service radio station. And obviously, you know, the CRTC likes to hear that kind of thing. You know, not that Magic 103 wasn't going to do the exact same thing. But he decided that it would be a very public serviced oriented radio station, and which indeed it has become, and any radio station in his right mind would do the same thing. He gets the license. We're crushed. I mean, we are absolutely crushed. All of a sudden, I get a call from Arnie and said, you know, your presentation was really good. Would you mind coming down and coming working for me? I didn't even bat an eyelash. I just said yes, because really my intent was to come back to the Maritimes and get a real good kickin' FM rock station on the air. So basically that's how it all started. And, you know, coming down here with my wife, who was living on the prairies all her life and seeing all this water. And I mean, as you're up on the 18th floor, you're looking out at the Atlantic Ocean that splits in between Dartmouth and Halifax, the penthouse view, playing rock and roll. I mean, does it get any better? So we had it was the most wonderful time of my life. I think probably the highlight of my career.
In the autumn of '83, Halifax was on the verge of a radio revolution the likes of which had never been experienced in the eastern third of the country. To that time, even rock radio on the AM band was a rarity in Nova Scotia's capital. DJs at CHNS had flirted with rock and roll. Personalities like Jimmy Mack and Frank Cameron built their fame on it. But CJCH won the rock wars in Halifax, overpowering the marketplace. In fact, in its mid-1970s heyday, CJCH rating books reported audiences larger than the combined population of Halifax, Dartmouth, and the suburbs.
Do that until midnight tonight. But Mr. Chuck O'Hara is going to roll in here and take over. See you right through until Sunday morning. CJCH with Diana Ross. Do you know where you're going to? You're going to send us to anyone traveling this evening. One for the road on CJ.
However, for many Nova Scotia radio listeners, the existing stations didn't satisfy their tastes. Among them was Doug Caldwell, a future Q104 music director and air personality who had moved to Dartmouth at the age of 10, and his hometown of Toronto, where today he holds the position of national marketing manager with Virgin Records. Doug recalls Halifax radio in the 70s as a big disappointment.
Lame. Totally lame. The only radio station that we had was 920 CJCH. There was one jock on 920 CJCH who I always thought was kind of cool. And if I'm not mistaken, he originally hailed from Cape Breton, Greg Lee. And if I'm not mistaken, he works here at 1050 Chum. I remember Greg when he was on CJCH, and I thought he had a great voice. He was entertaining. The rest of the radio station, they had Jerry Bear Lawrence right on the mornings, and I'm sorry, but lame-o. Everything else was lame-o. I remember one time in particular when I was about 16 years old, I called 920. I called in for a request. And I asked for Todd Rundgren, Hello, It's Me. We are talking about a top 10 pop hit on Billboard's Hot 100. and El Lamo DJ. Todd who? Thanks very much. You just answered all my questions I have regarding the state of radio in Halifax. Click. And it really wasn't until Q104 came on board that I felt, anyway, that the audience in Halifax, Dartmouth, Bedford, Lower Sackville, and all the surrounding areas were actually able to be introduced to a world of music that they had never really known before, because the only other station aside from 920 CJCH, of course, was C100. And C100 was a great radio station for what they played. But, you know, how often do you want to hear Ebony and Ivory by Paul McCartney?
C100, Metro's Best Albums, and the self-produced Dream of a Child by Burton Cummings. And that is Shiny Stockings. Give Me Your Love, Bryan Adams. Of course, he's had songs covered by BTO and Prism, and he is the former leader of Sweeney Todd. And Criss Cross, Sailing before that from the Criss Cross album. We also heard Air Supply, All Out of Love, and Honey High with Fleetwood Mac off their Tusk LP. 12 minutes after 1 o'clock. Good afternoon, I'm Jeff Banks.
Q104's current PM Drive announcers, J.C. Douglas, a Halifax native who first gained interest in radio while growing up in Dartmouth.
CJCH was the first radio station I was ever a real fan of before I left Nova Scotia around the age of 9. I mean, I thought it was great. And I kept listening to Top 40 when I was growing up in Midwestern Ontario, and we'd pick up, you know, daytime CKLW, Windsor, Detroit. Chum from Toronto sometimes, other stations. At nighttime, WLS from Chicago would boom in, WCFL before it went all talk in the mid-'70s. And my dad was still living in Dartmouth. And when I went to college at Fanshawe in London studying broadcasting in the fall of '83, he sent me a newspaper clipping that I think was from the Daily News. And the headline said it all. Q104, not for wimps. You know, it was classic Jake Edwards hyperbole on the station that he was about to put on the air. Iron Maiden, AC/DC, Motorhead, Zeppelin. Nothing but hard rock and roll 24 hours a day. And I thought, well, I don't think I'll ever be cut out for that sort of station. But while I'm down there, hopefully working at CJCH, I'll at least have a radio station to listen to.
The newly conceived radio station was christened CFRQ-FM. It was allotted a frequency of 104.3 megahertz, and again, modeled after CILQ in Toronto, Q107, the Dartmouth rocker was dubbed Q104.
That was Arnie's. Arnie's had those call letters. And still today, I still don't know why you guys don't use the Rock of the Atlantic. Please! It is like, I mean, Terry DeMonte and I, Terry's in Shoma FM. He was at Shoma at the time. He actually came up with it. He came on the phone. He said, the Rock of the Atlantic. I went, the Rock of the Atlantic. Yes, it's the Rock of the Atlantic. So, you know, he's working at FM 96 right now. I thought was like the most unbelievable name, and still today, you know. So that's, I mean, Rock of the Atlantic. And I remember the call letters. And Ray Plourde, Rockin' Ray Plourde, he was just out of Fanshawe College, was doing a lot of our production, and I thought he was just a brilliant kid, you know, and he would put, you know, I'd do the big voices, you know, the Rock of the Atlantic is Q104. And he'd have, you know, Q104, and we'd be running around like we had a bunch of kids working at the radio station. I hired kids. You know, we had no idea. I mean, maybe I was the one that had maybe an inkling of what was to go down at the radio station, and all these people were there, and I had to try and train them. Bob Powers was another guy who had a lot of, you know, he had quite a bit of maturity in broadcasting, and you know, so it was him and I and all the kids, and we just had a ball. I mean, it was really a fun time.
Bob Powers was born in London, Ontario. He moved to Moncton, New Brunswick, with his family in the mid-1960s. So by 1983, he had long since called the Maritimes home. And when Jake Edwards called Bob to come join him in the new venture, it was no stranger on the phone.
Well, I remember Jake from high school parties. Jake Edwards, Vernon Mazerol. But we didn't really know each other that well. We were more acquaintances than anything in high school. But I first worked with Jake in about 77, 78 at CKCW in Moncton. He did evenings, and I was doing all nights, and then eventually swing on down the line. And we used to trade off. He'd be doing evenings, I'd be doing all nights, or vice versa. I'd be doing evenings and have the night off. And we traded up at the top of the office building that we worked in was a CN Hotel bar called Cloud 9, and we both DJ'd there. Some wild memories there. But we had a lot of fun together. We worked together about, a little better than a year, maybe 18 months. And then Jake went to Winnipeg, and I came to Halifax.
92 City FM Winnipeg. Let it scatter. That smell, that hum, that stunk. 17 in front of 9 o'clock, Brother Jake Edwards on the radio. And if it's starting to stunk around your house, maybe it's time for the trash outside. Trash day number 5.
So we had a party last night?
Yes, another endless. That's
never
right.
ending.
Hey, listen, big guy.
Long parties.
That's right. Only 2 more days now.
Yeah. Well, 3 more.
Well, we're not counting today.
Oh, okay.
Believe me, we're not counting today.
In 1979, Bob Powers hit the Halifax airwaves for the first time as a swing announcer and later in afternoon drive on C100. He was also a music director under future Q104 PD Barry Horn until Bob left the station in 1981. It was 2 years later when the call came that lured Bob back to Nova Scotia.
Well, I was working at CKSL in London when Jake called me at home and said, how would you like to put a rock and roll radio station on the map in Halifax? And we'll run the show before we're even 30. And I was excited. But it was funny because when Jake and I worked together in Moncton prior, I said, I love the guy. He's one of the best guys to work with, but I don't know if I could work for him, right? It's like you just got to keep up, right? And the next thing you know, he's calling me, and he's got this deal put together with some independents out of Winnipeg. And they unfortunately didn't get the license, but through a back door, Jake was offered the job as program director, and he was still on the phone calling me. He had called me prior to the license hearing and whatnot. But next thing you know, he calls me back. You ready to go? Get your bags packed? And I told my wife, Judy, it's time to make a decision. And I'd been at CKSL for 18 months, so I just walked into my PD, Jerry Stevens at the time, and said, it's been sweet, but I got to go. I'm going back to Halifax, where I want to put down roots to do this. And it was the day the book started. That was priceless. Took it like a man, too, I'll tell you. Well, that's okay. We always thought you'd probably want to go home sometime. That's that maritime thing. And I'd grown up in London, St. Thomas, so it was kind of interesting. Then we came back here and fired her up in October of 83. We hit the air in November 28th, 1983.
Bob Powers arrived in Halifax as Q104's first midday jock and music director and discovered that he and Jake had only a matter of weeks to build a radio station from the ground up.
I arrived at Q104, which was CFDR at the time. The studios were being put together. That was in October 6th of 1983. Walked in here. Boogeyman, Jake and I get together after a while, and next thing I know, I'm standing in an empty office looking out over Dartmouth in the Halifax Harbor. It's completely empty. There's a hole in the floor with a phone cord hanging of it, no phone on it. I get a phone hooked up to it, and I sit down on the floor with my briefcase open, and I started calling record reps. I'd asked the music director, program director of CFDR at that time, Gail Rice, for some record catalogs, and we didn't have a one, at least up to date. So I was calling all my buds that I knew in the industry, record labels and whatnot, and I proceeded to order $10,000 worth of album product. Wound up being around 15, I think. I heard about it anyway at a budget meeting at one point. But we put the shelves in, and next thing you know, we had a library being built, and we had a number of releases sent down from Q107, which originally was a consultant on the the birth, if you will, and the building of the station, programming-wise, and setting things up, and what people to go after, I'm sure. And they sent us some albums from Toronto. They were kind of an after-ran, so we were starting from the ground up our library. I was quite proud of that when we built it. There's a lot of great rock and roll in that library over there, I'll tell you.
As Arie Patterson recalls, the fledgling radio station had no shortage of eager broadcasters who wanted in on the ground floor.
We were inundated at Q104 with applications, hundreds. And my daughter, Laurie, who was then the promotions director on CFDR, took on the task of doing the interviews and going through them, and we were able to pick out some outstanding people, many of whom stayed for a long time, Bob Powers and J.C. Douglas and others, and of course Brother Jake. Well, Brother Jake, I'll take the credit for him, because I went to Toronto and met him at Q107. He was visiting them, but he had been there earlier, and they'd shipped him off to Winnipeg. And Gary Slate, who we had hired as a consultant, who was then the manager of Q107 and the son of a friend of mine, recommended Brother Jake. Now, the price tag was much higher than, I'm sure he was the highest paid guy in radio in Halifax, Dartmouth at the time. But I thought if we were going to go on this somewhat Star Trek trip into rock, that we'd go with the best. So I made the decision. We brought Jake in, and he played a very major role in launching what has become a very exciting radio station, and which I think was exciting from day one. There is no question, I think, that even historically, going back over the years, there has never been as creative a radio station in the Maritimes as Q104.
One of those hundreds of applicants was Doug Caldwell, whose Dartmouth upbringing helped satisfy Arnie's desire for local talent.
I think that was probably one of the key elements to me getting that job there. Because I was working at another radio station, Annapolis Valley Radio in Kentville, with another Dartmouth boy, Dave Bannerman. I must have applied to Q104 before it had gone on the air. I must have applied at least 10 times. I sent at least 3 resumes and 3 air checks, all updating each other, and I phoned. And who I talked to was Arie Patterson, Arie Patterson's daughter. So I called her, and she said, well, we haven't really hired a program director just yet, but as soon as we get around to listening to, he gets around to listening to your tape, we'll give you a call either way. So eventually I got a phone call from Jake Edwards, and he said, go on down for a meeting. So I went down, and I didn't know what to expect, right? Going back to Dartmouth, I knew who Arie Patterson was, and I knew that the staff of the old CFDR was pretty stale. It was like walking into a hospital ward, It's just like I knew what to expect on that side, but I didn't know Jake Edwards. I didn't know him from a hole in the ground. All I knew was that Dave Bannerman said, "Here's a picture of Jake Edwards. Here's what the guy is going to look like." And of course, I was like, "That's Jake Edwards, okay." And when I got to the station, I was sitting in the reception area, and all I remember hearing was this guy walking down the hallway going, "Hey, how's it going? Yeah, doing this. And the arms were flailing everywhere, and I was like, yo, this is Jake? Come on to my office. I'm like, okay, it's down to 2 shifts. What do you want, swing shift or all-night shift? And I went, well, I'll take the all-night shift. So I took that. That's where I started. And like I said, it took 3 resumes, 3 air checks, and about 10 phone calls to finally get in there. But I still think to this day that Arie Patterson knew I was a Dartmouth boy. I went to Dartmouth High School, and I think he wanted to have some sort of hometown presence, because Jake was coming in from Winnipeg, Bob Powers was coming in from Moncton, if I wasn't mistaken, Andy Kay came in from Montreal.
One of Jake's prime acquisitions was Doug Barron, a native of Kitchener, Ontario, who toiled through smaller Ontario markets like Simcoe, Richmond Hill, and Brampton in both on-air and production capabilities, before heading east in the mid-'70s to ply his multi-talents for CJCH.
I hooked up with Chum Radio. Paul Ski brought me to Halifax to be the production manager at CJCH. I worked there for 2.5 years as production manager until C100 went on the air. Then I became production manager of C100 and CJCH. Then I gradually drifted back into the on-air chair and became the morning guy and swing guy and everything like that. And then I decided to get out of radio for a while. Went back to freelancing, doing voice work, a little bit of advertising stuff, until I heard wind of the fact that Q104 was going to be coming on the air, and I was terribly excited. And I hooked up with both the original applicants for the station at the time, which was Arie Patterson and a guy named the Magic Christian. I'm trying to think of his real name. Anyways, he was there were 2 applicants, so I hooked up with both of them, and then eventually Brother Jake found me through an audition tape that I had forwarded to Arie Patterson with a funny, wacky picture of myself on the cover, which perked Jake's interest, and he called me up at 3 a.m. from Winnipeg and said, "Hey, we got to work together." 3 a.m. he called me, because it was Winnipeg time, so it must have been 10 or 11 for him. And I had sent a little tape box with my audition, Doug Barron radio audition, with a real nice corporate Mike Smooth acting photo on the front. But when you lifted the lid of the box, there was another shot of me with my hair straight up and this crazy look of bewilderment on my face, and Jake immediately, he told me he was sitting in his living room with a pile of audition tapes with no tape deck, just looking at tape covers, and he reacted to that one and called me up on the spur, and we got along famously right from the word go.
He was looking for a creative outlet. I just happened to be, there, and I was looking through, I remember looking through his application. He had a picture of himself with his hair, with hair gel stuck straight up in the air with that expression he used to do. And I looked at him, I said, this guy is incredible. I didn't even hear the tape. I called him up, I said, come on in. And I hired him right on the spot.
Jake and I talked, and originally I was going to be the afternoon drive guy until we were driving across the bridge one day, and he said, yeah, I want kind of a sidekick morning wacky news guy. And I said, and I had never done news before, and I said, hey, I can do that. And he said, well, we got to come up with a name. And it was literally driving across the bridge.
Well, Hal Harbour, a.k.a. Doug Barron, and I were driving across the bridge one day, and we're trying to come up for a name. And we're thinking, I'm looking out. And I kept thinking, Al Arbor, hockey, Halifax Harbor, Hal Harbour. It's Hal Harbour. And I was really going to give him like a midday afternoon slot. And he said to me, I want to be your co-host. I said, can you read news? Hell yeah. And that's where that started. Probably the most creative time that I've ever spent in 25 years. We would come in here on Saturdays, and we would go in at 11 o'clock and come out at 5 in the afternoon. And we would have, I think we wrote maybe 80 songs in the 2 years we were there, plus all the comedy bits. You know, Jane Fondle, Misinformation, Les Ismore. It was Fantasyland. It was Fantasyland. And we could do anything we want because Arnie really let us go. And he trusted everything I did, even though at times I had no idea what I was doing.
The proposed October '83 launch was soon abandoned, and the station lost a chance to score in the fall BBM ratings book. Meanwhile, a staff of anxious disc jockeys was left with plenty of time to kill and creative juices flowing, which assured that Q104 would not soon run short of pre-produced on-air material.
Well, that was totally fascinating. Before we actually went on the air, we were hired and on salary and here in the building for a month before we went on the air. And talk about bizarre, coming to work every day and just preparing. We weren't on the air, there was no music playing. So you can imagine the excitement and the build-up as we're waiting for the switch to be turned on. And we were basically recruiting our talent, and I convinced Jake to hire a friend of mine named Sylvia Schmidt, who became Jane Fondle, who was a comedian that I had done stand-up with. So we decided to bring her on board. Brenda Oland was working over across the street at CJCH. We decided to bring her over as a kind of an offbeat traffic reporter / news person. I think Andrew Gillis was probably here at that time, too. I don't know whether it was right from the word go or not, but... and then we also had a talk show to design. We had a show called The Talk Show, which we brought... we were starting to catalog and bank a bunch of interviews that we had in the can for that show. So it was just endless amounts of fun and anticipation getting ready to throw the switch.
We were supposed to go on the air October 15th and never made it till November 28th. We had some people not getting paid for those weeks. They were asked to sit it out at home, which was kind of tough. And our 10-year vets working the 6A to 6P were looking for things to do. They were on salary. Would you like to tag a few albums for me? I'll never forget Andy K. I'll call the high schools. I'll set up a liaison. Andy K. calling the high schools, setting up a liaison. That was priceless. It was great. But he had something to do. You know, we could justify a salary there. And Andy knows I'm teasing because he did a lot of other things. He was great with promotions. That was where our own people really got involved with what was going on entertainment-wise in the city.
Andy K. brought 15 years of radio experience to Q104's afternoon slot when he returned to Halifax to help sign on the new station.
I had worked at CJCH in the early 70s, music director and on the air. And I also went back a couple of years. I left and gone to Montreal. Then I went back to CHNS, and I was doing evenings there. And then I went back to Montreal, and, I just loved it down in the Maritimes. I had worked in Sydney, in Moncton, in St. John, New Brunswick, in Halifax. So I wanted to go back again, and this Q104 radio station was getting started up, and it was Gary Slate, who I heard from, and he said, "Hey, call this Brother Jake guy." I said, "Who?" "Brother Jake." I said, "Which monastery?" He said, "Winnipeg." Okay, so I called Brother Jake, and I was already talking to, at that time, the two other radio stations in Halifax, because I wasn't desperate to make a move, but I wanted to make a move, within 6 months or whatever, and get back in Halifax. And he told me about this brand new Q104, and I sent him this most outrageous air check that I could find that I was doing at Shom FM. In fact, it was one of my, I think, overnight shows with Crazy Eddie and the lead singer from New York, all these people on the telephone line. It was just outrageous, and I said, "Hey, if they like this tape, I want to work there." I sent the tape. They said, "Great! Afternoon drive."
Andy Kay. There's another veteran. Andy Kay is a veteran, and this story goes way back when I was working in Moncton at CKCW. We talk about this. Andy Kay was at CKCW. I just got out of Boston. Went to school down there to study radio. And Andy Kay was in there, and I was really having a hard time finding a job. I had a degree, went to every radio station, wouldn't hire me. And Andy Kay brought me in and said, "Look, let's put a better tape together. Let's get a tape together." So I took that tape, ended up in Bathurst. And then Andy Kay came knocking at my door, and it was really weird to have him come in, and he was the only guy that really gave me a shot. So I decided, Andy was looking for a job. I gave him afternoon drive. He was a veteran, of course, more of a veteran than I was, but it was neat having him here.
One of the earliest arrivals to the new Q staff was Ray Plord, another product of Gary Slate's one-year consultancy out of Q107 Toronto.
Came to Halifax about 2 months before they actually signed on. They already had an AM sister station who did a very music of your life type format, and I was plugged in as the production director, and I was doing work for them while the rest of the Q104 team was assembled, and we got held off by the CRTC because of some technical change that had to be made to the transmitter power output, I don't know what, but we got held off for like 2 months, so that here was this vibrant team just pinning off the walls to go to work and to do something that had never been done in this market before, and kick some ass against the competitors, and there was that feistiness, and we were held off for 2 months, and it was just brutal. We were in the control room, everything was set up, we were playing as if there were shifts. I remember during testing actually that at one point the radio station was on, and the chief engineer at the transmitter site had to phone us up, a Scottish gentleman, and he phoned us up and went, "You have to stop being on the air because you're on the air and we're not allowed to be on the air." And he always got his way, so we turned it right off. But for a few minutes there, the first song that ever really ran across the airwaves at full strength at this radio station was, and halfway through the song, was Rock Rock Till You Drop by Def Leppard. And there was a lot of confusion later on with, contests. What was our first song? Because technically there were two. And the other one, of course, was the Led Zeppelin classic Rock and Roll, and was a fitting start, but it was a planned start. There was the accidental start, and a lot of people were listening during that period because we were held off and held off and held off, and there was a large audience waiting for something to happen. There had been a lot of publicity, and it was so there were actually 2 official starts to the station.
Though it was a disappointment for the eager on-air staff, as Bob Powers recalls, the delay of getting to air did not affect the amount of press Q104 was receiving.
They had a lot of upstart, younger reporters at the Daily News, and one of their things to do was stir the pot, and what a way to stir it up, entertainment-wise in Metro, than to stir it up about this new rock and roll radio station coming. It's coming, and they kept the fires burning for almost 2 years about it. And then they were just inundated all the summer of '83, waiting. And we went on the air November 28th. The prior week, it was all test pattern. We said, "The heck with it, we've got to go. These people are chomping at the bit." So we kind of raced ahead of the game before we had true official go, and we went with a test period of nothing but seamless classic rock albums. I still get people that talk to me now saying, "What a great way to sign on a radio station." And everybody does it, but I don't think anybody ever did it to the extent that we did. Never opened the mic. Just rolled the music and all the tunes that they'd never heard a radio station in this town, and if they did, it was so rare a track, something that may have been, like on the old CJCH to hear Foxy Lady or Fire by Jimi Hendrix along those lines, but none of the stuff we were playing, Blue Oyster Cult, none of that. Nazareth, it just didn't fly here.
One of those upstart cub reporters at the Daily News was Q104's future afternoon mainstay, Andrew Gillis. Andrew had recently returned from an aborted attempt at a musical career in Toronto with a cynical disposition.
I had written a nasty prospectus based on Arie Patterson's press release concerning the new Q104, which did not in any way try to distance Q104 from the identity of Q107 in Toronto that I'd just been exposed to, and which was really heavy. A lot of Judas Priest, a lot of glam rock, a lot of stuff really that is kind of maybe dated now, but Q107 maybe doesn't play a lot of the music they did at that time. Q104 came on and did kind of go a little bit in that direction, but not as much as I had predicted in the Daily News. So Arie Patterson's been good about that. She's since forgiven me for slamming Q104 as being, for no-minded metalheads, or I can't quite remember what I said. But I was nasty, and I think I proved wrong a little bit musically, especially after a couple of years. But I must say, the first couple of years, as some people know me as the newsman, bluesman, Judas Priest is not up my alley. So there were times in the first couple of years when Q's music did kind of come out the way I predicted, and at least to Arie Patterson, I'm sure I looked like an enormous hypocrite.
In part 2 of our tribute to Q104, we'll meet more of the air staff as they tell the wild but true stories behind the scenes as Q104 takes to the air.